Imagine an empire, one that's the largest and most diverse in the world at the time. It's a land of wealth and wonder, but beneath the surface it's plagued by deep-seated social inequality and political turmoil. A volatile cocktail of economic disparity, widespread repression, and technological revolution had been brewing, ready to shake the very foundations of these vast lands. Our journey today takes us back to the heart of Russia, just a little over a century ago, a period when the old world collided with the new in a fierce battle of ideologies and ambitions. As we dive into the annals of history, you might notice striking parallels with present-day Russia. The same relentless pursuit of power, the same ambitions for global dominance, and the same simmering unrest, overlooked by its leaders, until it reaches that critical boiling point. The year is 1904. Russia and Japan are on the brink of Armageddon, in a conflict historically known as the Russo-Japanese War that would last until 1905 and ended as a major turning point for the Russian sphere of influence. The war was primarily fought over rival imperial ambitions in Manchuria and Korea, with both Russia and Japan seeking to expand their influence in the region. One, a vast empire with a powerful military, was seen as the Goliath in this fight. The other, still in its Meiji era of modernization and expansion, was the perceived David. Yet the outcome of this war would defy these expectations and shock the geopolitical world at the time. The war began with a surprise Japanese naval attack on the Tsar's Eastern Fleet at Port Arthur. Russia, unprepared with its slow, outdated, and corrupt military for the agile and modern Japanese forces, suffered heavy losses early in the war, while land battles, such as the Siege of Port Arthur and the Battle of Mukden, were marked by Japanese tactical superiority and Russian strategic disasters. Despite its numerical superiority, the vast empire's army was unable to secure a decisive victory. The war exposed the inefficiencies and corruption within the Russian military and government at the time, leading to widespread discontent among the general populace. Meanwhile, Japan's victories boosted its international standing, marking its emergence as a global power and bolstering its population for the carnage yet to come. The war ended with the Treaty of Portsmouth, mediated by then U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. The treaty recognized Japan's dominance over the Korean peninsula and granted it the defeated Russians' lease of Port Arthur, among other humiliating concessions. Now, I'm sure you can imagine, the war had far-reaching implications for Russia and her people. For the citizens of the empire, this was a bitter pill to swallow. It marked the first time in modern history that a rising Asian power defeated a European one, which dealt a significant blow to Russia's idyllic prestige. The defeat also exposed the weaknesses of the Tsarist regime to the Russian public and the world, undermining its legitimacy and authority. Moreover, the war strained Russia's already fragile economy, leading to food shortages, unemployment, and rampant inflation. The burden of war fell heavily on the working class and peasantry, causing widespread discontent and social unrest. This laid the groundwork for the revolutionary movements and fringe ideologies that would soon shake the foundations of society. In terms of foreign relations, of course, the war changed the balance of power significantly. Her defeat forced it to retreat from the Asian region, leaving a power vacuum that the rising sun was eager to fill in the decades to follow. The Russo-Japanese War was a watershed moment for the Bear. Thousands of unarmed demonstrators, led by Father Georgy Gapon, marched towards the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, hoping to present a petition to Tsar Nicholas II. Their demands were simple: better working conditions, an 8-hour workday, and a constitutional assembly. Sounds fair to us today, right? Well, things were very different in the early 1900s. Instead of a receptive audience in the Tsar, however, they were met with the cold steel of the Imperial Guard's rifles. The massacre that ensued left hundreds dead and sparked a wave of indignation that quickly swept across the vast country. That bloody day was not an isolated incident, but the spark that ignited the flames of an event historically called the Russian Revolution of 1905. Strikes and protests erupted throughout the empire, from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. Peasants revolted, demanding land and freedom from servitude. Ethnic minorities, long persecuted and underrepresented, vested for any sense of autonomy. Intellectuals and liberals called for radical political reform previously unseen in this part of the world at the time. Russia was a powder keg because of the many deeply rooted problems within the empire, and Bloody Sunday was the match that set it off. The government's response was swift and notably brutal. Martial law was declared in many regions. strikes ruthlessly crushed through force, protesters arrested, and revolutionaries executed. Yet the more the authorities clamped down, the more resistant the people became. The revolt, no longer just a series of isolated protests, had become a widespread movement, with a call for change so loud that it could no longer be ignored. In October, a mass general strike paralyzed every facet of the nation. The government was forced to make immediate concessions or risk catastrophe. Tsar Nicholas issued the October Manifesto, promising civil liberties and the creation of a Duma, or parliament, elected by the people, for the people. This was a significant step towards a constitutional monarchy, a momentous shift for a nation that had been under autocratic rule for centuries prior. However, the promises of the October Manifesto were nowhere near fully implemented, and constant corners were cut on the side of the ruling elite. As a result, just a few months after its first meeting, the Duma was dissolved, and the Tsar retained much of his original autocratic power. The revolution had not brought about the profound change that many had hoped for, but also was not a complete failure either. It exposed the cracks in the Tsarist regime and showed the world that the Russian people were not always just docile and content to live under the boot of autocratic rule. This unrest paved the way and gave birth to the rise of groups like the Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, and a list of other fringe and politically active groups. It was a prelude to the more radical changes that were to come in the next decades. A rehearsal, as some historians would say, for the upcoming revolutions of 1917 and the Russian Civil War. It's now late 1905, and the Russian domain is in the throes of major political upheaval. The seeds of revolt had been sown, and they're about to germinate in a series of events that will shake the nation to the point of near total collapse. The catalyst for this revolution, on top of the significant numbers of lost in the war, was a general demonstration on a cold January day and a terrifying response that would later be known as Bloody Sunday. In the turbulent years following the chaos, Russia was a boiling pot of political unrest. Amidst this turmoil, a radical faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party emerged, calling themselves the Bolsheviks. The name Bolshevik was derived from the Russian word for majority, signifying their split from the Mensheviks, or minority, who were the other side of the Labor Party at the time of its split. Led by Vladimir Lenin, the Bolsheviks were a force to be reckoned with. Lenin was a charismatic leader, a man with a vision who believed in the dictatorship of the proletariat. He proposed that the working class should hold political power and control the means of production, a radical concept in a country dominated by the aristocracy. But Lenin wasn't alone. Alongside him was Leon Trotsky, a brilliant orator and tactician. Together they sought to overthrow the existing order and create a society free from exploitation, where the working class holds their destiny. Well, that was the idea anyways. The Bolsheviks gained popularity by tapping into the discontent that permeated society. They chanted their popular slogan, "Peace, land, and bread," promising an end to the unpopular war, land for the peasants, and food for all. These promises resonated with the masses, who were tired of the constant war, hungry and desperate for change. Under the hood of the empire, revolution was simmering yet again. In April, Lenin, who had spent nearly a decade in exile, returned and published his April Theses, calling for all Soviets, or workers' councils, to take power. The Bolsheviks began to infiltrate these Soviets one by one, spreading their message and gaining widespread support. But their fight was not all fun and games. The Bolsheviks' rise to power was met with stiff resistance, leading to a brutal civil war in the years to follow and the complete collapse of society as a whole. But for now, we're getting ahead of ourselves. The fires of the Great War are raging across Europe, and Russia is about to be thrown into the meat grinder herself. The war was initially greeted with patriotic fervor, with many believing it would unite the country and stifle the rising tide of revolution. As we know, however, the reality proved far different. The war placed an immense strain on Russia's already faltering economy and infrastructure. The country was ill-prepared for the demands of modern warfare. A shortage of ammunition, poor transportation, and inadequate medical facilities were but a few of the challenges the army faced. As the war dragged on, the losses mounted. By the end of 1917, millions of Russian soldiers had been either killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. The morale of the troops plummeted, and desertions became commonplace. On the home front, the situation was no better. Food and fuel shortages became the norm, leading to skyrocketing prices and widespread famine. The people's faith in their czar's ability to lead was quickly eroding, yet again. In the midst of this chaos, the seeds of revolution began to sprout once more. The February Revolution, as it came to be known, was not a carefully planned event. It was a spontaneous uprising fueled by years of dissatisfaction with the monarchy and exacerbated by the hardships of war. It began on February 23, 1917, with a series of strikes and protests in Petrograd, now St. Petersburg. Workers took to the streets demanding bread, and soon their cries were joined by other groups, students, intellectuals, and even many soldiers. The Tsar's attempts to quell the protests with military force only served to fan the flames. Soldiers began to defect even more en masse, refusing to fire on their fellow countrymen. Within a week, the protests had turned into an outright rebellion. The Tsar was losing his grip on power entirely. On March 2nd, Nicholas II abdicated the throne, marking the end of more than 3 centuries of Romanov rule. The provisional government, made up of members of the Duma, Russia's parliament, assumed control. However, their time in power would be short-lived. The war continued to rage on, and the new government's decision to keep Russia in the conflict did little to quell the people's discontent. The February Revolution was a pivotal moment in history. It marked the downfall of the monarchy and the empire and paved the way for the greater rise of the Bolsheviks. However, it was not the end of Russia's troubles. Far from it. The country was still at war, and the provisional government's grip on power was tenuous at best. October 1917. The setting, the capital Petrograd, a city simmering with discontent under the backdrop of all of the hunger and loss. The provisional government, established following the February Revolution, is losing its grip on power, and quickly. On the night of the 24th, the Bolsheviks launched their audacious plan, a coup d'etat. Now you see, this revolution isn't a violent uprising of the masses, as one might imagine. Not this time. Instead, it's a calculated seizure of key strategic points in the core of the city. The government is caught off guard, and within a day, the Bolsheviks have control over the city. Lenin, seizing the moment, announces the dissolution of the ruling governing powers. He declares the establishment of a new system, one led by the workers and peasants of the land. This is the birthing of the Soviet model, a political idea based on the principles of Marxism-Leninism. Now, let's take a step back and ponder the broader implications of this revolution, as it really wasn't just a simple change of leadership. It was about a complete overhaul of the Russian society and economy. The Bolsheviks introduced a radical new political system, one that aimed to dismantle the class hierarchies and distribute wealth equally among the citizens. For the first time in history, a country was attempting to implement the principles of communism on a monumental scale. This was a daring social and economic experiment, one that would have far-reaching consequences not just for Russia, but for the whole world, right up to this very day. The October Revolution also had a profound impact on the international political landscape. It sent shock waves through the Western powers, who were alarmed by the rise of a communist economic and political system. The Bolsheviks' radical implementations were met with further resistance from various aspects of society. And so, Russia entered a new chapter in its history, one marked by mass revolutions, ideological clashes, and social transformation on an industrial scale. The Russian Civil War is about to begin. Unfolding between 1917 and 22, it was a war that tore the nation apart at its seams, birthing iterations of previously existing nations and new ones alike. Now the clash was primarily a conflict between the Bolshevik Red Army and a coalition of anti-Bolshevik forces known as the White Army. However, the Civil War was far from a simple, two-sided affair. It was a complex and chaotic struggle involving multiple factions, each with its own agenda and alliances, often shifting and unpredictable. A real Game of Thrones, unfolding through the pages of somewhat recent history. The Red Army, under the leadership of Leon Trotsky, was made up of industrial workers and peasants, as well as some previous members of the Tsar's army. In their minds, they were fighting for the socialist ideals of the October Revolution, aiming to establish a society free from economic exploitation and social inequality. Their opponents, the White Army, was a diverse coalition of anti-Bolshevik forces. It included monarchists, Republicans, conservatives, and liberals, united only by their common opposition to the Bolsheviks' meteoric rise. Yet, there were other players in this conflict. There were the Green Armies, made up of other peasant groups who opposed both the Reds and the Whites due to their respective policies of grain requisitioning. There were the nationalist movements in regions like Ukraine and the Baltic states, seeking independence from Russia. Finally, there were the foreign powers, who saw in the Russian Civil War an opportunity to intervene and shape the outcome in their favor. The intervention by Western powers was a significant aspect of the Civil War. Britain, France, the United States, and Japan, among others, all sent troops to Russia. They provided support to the White Army, hoping to prevent the spread of Bolshevism. However, their involvement was met with limited operational success and much controversy within the Russian public, further bolstering the Red Army numbers. On the battlefield, the war was marked by its brutality and devastation. It was a war of attrition, with both sides resorting to terror tactics and harsh reprisals against their perceived enemies, not unlike the previous conflicts fought that century. Despite the odds, the Red Army emerged victorious. The reasons for their success are manifold. They had control over the industrial heartland of Russia, enabling them to produce weapons and supplies. They had a clear unifying ideology that resonated with enough of the masses, and they had critically effective leadership in the form of Trotsky, who instituted a rigorous system of discipline and training within the Red Army. The conclusion of the Russian Civil War marked the beginning of the Soviet Union. The Bolsheviks had managed to consolidate their power and establish their socialist state. The war had taught them the importance of a strong, centralized government and the need for a powerful military to defend against the revolution. They had also learned the dangers of foreign intervention, leading them to adopt a policy they coined socialism in one country, focusing on building socialism at home while maintaining a cautious approach to international relations. However, the war had once again left deep scars throughout the lands. The economy was in ruins, with industry and agriculture severely disrupted. The population had been decimated, with millions of dead from fighting, famine, and disease. The social fabric of the country was in shatters, with communities divided and families torn apart. In the aftermath of the chaos, the Soviet Union embarked on a process of reconstruction and transformation at absolutely any cost. The new economic policy was introduced, a temporary measure that allowed for some degree of private enterprise to stimulate economic recovery. At the same time, the process of collectivization and industrialization began, aimed at transforming the Soviet Union into a modern industrial state. As the 1940s dawned, the world once again found itself marching to the beat of war drums. The Second World War was about to begin, and the Soviet Union, under the leadership of the ruthless Joseph Stalin, was about to play a pivotal role. But what led to this? How did we end up down the path of Armageddon yet again? Let's rewind to August of 1939. The world was teetering on the brink. In a surprising turn of events, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression pact that shocked the geopolitical landscape. Not only did it promise peace between the two nations, but it also secretly outlined the third partitioning of Poland, effectively setting the stage for another world war. However, this uneasy alliance was not to last. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched his Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history, against the Soviet Union. The early months of the war were disastrous for the Soviets. The Red Army was ill-prepared for the German onslaught, and the Nazis rapidly advanced, capturing vast territories and causing devastating losses. Stalin initially refused to believe he had been betrayed. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn at the Battle of Moscow in the winter of 1941. The Soviet Union's harsh weather and the Red Army's fierce resistance halted the German advance, marking the first major setback for Hitler's war machine. 1942 saw the Battle of Stalingrad, one of the bloodiest battles in human history, which turned the tide of the war decisively in the Soviet Union's favor. The Red Army's relentless defense of the city, followed by a counteroffensive that encircled and crushed the German Sixth Army, marked a significant turning point. It shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility and boosted the morale of the Allied forces. The Soviet military might was not the only factor in its pivotal role in the war, bolstered with a seemingly infinite number of military equipment from the Allied powers under the Lend-Lease Act. The Red Army's westward push following their victory at Stalingrad marked the beginning of a strategic offensive that would last until the end of the war. The Battle of Kursk in 1943, the largest tank battle in history, further solidified the Soviet Union's military dominance. By 1944, Stalin's army had begun its twisted version of liberating the Eastern European countries from Nazi control, starting with Romania and Bulgaria, and culminating with the capture of Berlin in 1945. This marked the end of World War II in the region, but it also set the stage for the Soviet Union's brutal domination of Eastern Europe, which would last for the next 4 decades, with reverberations still felt in these regions today. At the Yalta and Potsdam conferences in 1945, the Big Three, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, outlined the new post-war world order. The Union's significant role in defeating Nazi Germany gave it a strong hand in these negotiations. Unfortunately for Russia and the planet at large, the end of World War II did not bring lasting peace. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new conflict, the Cold War. The ideological differences between the West and East, already evident during the fight against the Nazis, became more pronounced in its aftermath. Now let's take a dive into the ideological maelstrom that was the Soviet Union. A powerhouse of Marxist-Leninist ideology, it was more than just a geographical entity. This concept, based on the works of Karl Marx and further developed by Lenin, was the driving force behind the actions and policies of the Union. It was a vision that rejected the capitalist system, advocating instead for a society where the means of production were owned by the workers, where there were no classes, and where wealth was distributed as needed. Well, or so they say, this ideology was not confined within the borders of the Soviet Union. It was a vision that was exported around the globe, fermenting revolutions, causing political upheavals, and shaping the course of history. The Cold War, a decades-long standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union, was a manifestation of this ideological clash. On one side was the capitalist West, led by the United States, championing free markets, democracy, and individual liberties. On the other side was the communist East, led by the Soviet Union, advocating for a classless society, state ownership of the means of production, and the abolishment of private property. This divide led to a monumental global power struggle, with nations around the world caught in the crossfire. From the jungles of Vietnam to the streets of Berlin, from the mountains of Afghanistan to the plains of Africa, the Cold War left its mark, and it was far from frozen. Stalin, with his state-controlled media and propaganda machine, projected his nation as a model for others to follow. It provided financial and military support to revolutionary movements and newly independent nations, expanding its sphere of influence. But they were not just exporting ideology. It was also a major player in international politics and the global economy. It was a founding member of the United Nations, a nuclear superpower, and a key player in the upcoming space race. However, beneath the surface, the Union was plagued by systemic problems. Its centrally planned economy, while successful in industrializing the nation and creating a strong military, was riddled with inefficiencies and deep capitalist-like corruption. Its political system, which promised power to the people, was marked by repression and a lack of political freedoms. Its society, which was supposed to be classless and poverty-free, was marked by stark inequalities and regular inflation. These problems, coupled with the economic and military pressures of the Cold War, began to take a toll on the Goliath. The economy stagnated, living standards fell even further, and discontent grew. The cracks in the system began to show. The ideology that once united the people and inspired revolutions of change around the world began to lose its appeal. The system was now crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions. The Soviet Union, once a superpower, is about to collapse. The fall of the Union was as dramatic as its rise, and its aftermath continues to shape the world today. The collapse of this once mighty superpower was not an overnight event, but a gradual process, marked by a series of crises and failures that began in the late 1980s. The economy is in shambles, strangled by the inefficiencies of a centrally planned system, corruption, and mismanagement. Despite its military might and global influence, the Soviet Union was unable to keep its own house in order. The reform efforts of Mikhail Gorbachev, the last general secretary of the Communist Party, and the disastrous losses involved in the failed invasion of Afghanistan were significant catalysts for speeding the collapse. Gorbachev initiated perestroika, a restructuring of the political and economic system, and glasnost, a policy of transparency and openness. These reforms, intended to revitalize society, only served to further expose the deep-seated weaknesses and corruption within the system. The people, once blind to these flaws, began to question the legitimacy of the Communist Party. Nationalistic sentiments in the republics grew stronger, leading to calls for independence that only grew louder because of the largest portion of those killed in the Afghan war being from the poorest and most disadvantaged regions of Russia, not unlike the war in Ukraine of today. The Baltic states were among the first to break away, followed by others in a wave of secession that the Kremlin was powerless to stop, although it definitely tried with what little army it had left. By the end of 1991, the Union was no more. 15 independent countries emerged from its ashes, each grappling with its newfound freedom and the challenges that came with it. The red flag over the Kremlin was lowered, replaced by the tricolor of the Russian Federation. The fall of the Soviet Union marked the end of the Cold War. It signified the victory of capitalism over communism and of democracy over totalitarianism. Well, at least that's how it was perceived in the West. For Russia, the collapse was a time of great turmoil and uncertainty. It was a time of national humiliation. The transition from a planned economy to a market economy was fraught with difficulties. The 90s were marked by hyperinflation, widespread poverty, and corruption. The people, who had lived under a system that guaranteed employment and social security, were now thrust into a world of uncertainty led by warlords and mafioso strongmen, one destined to emerge from the ashes with the goal of saving the Russian people. Under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, Russia sought to reassert itself as a global power, and under his watchful eye, there's been a conscious effort to reclaim what many Russians see as their rightful place in the world order, a sentiment fueled by the loss of territories during the Union's collapse. This has led to a more assertive foreign policy, as seen in Russia's many post-Soviet conflicts, including reasserting their dominance over areas like Chechnya, Dagestan, and Tatarstan, while occupying parts of Georgia, Moldova, and of course Ukraine, where the Russian military has seen astronomical loss of life once more on an industrial scale. Sadly, that's just to name a few. The list of conflicts is seemingly endless, and in many cases involves multiple invasions of the same country. All done as the last dying throngs of a global superpower, just trying to stay relevant. One that once comprised a significant portion of the planet, and whose goals had them poised to take over the world. But that was then, and this is now. As Russia continues to navigate its path in the post-Soviet world, the echoes of its past continue to reverberate, shaping not just itself, but the world around it at large. As we stand on the brink of a future that seems to echo the past, we find ourselves asking, could the events leading up to the collapse of the old empire be repeated in today's Russia? Are we hurtling towards a similar situation, or an even worse one? Better yet, is it a continuously unfolding event with its end yet to be determined? The lessons from history are clear. Discontent and unrest can lead to revolution. Losses in war can strain a nation to breaking points. Ideologies can greatly shape the global political directions. And empires, no matter how large, can and will fall.